For Antiwar.com, I'm Scott Horton. This is Antiwar Radio. And I'm happy to welcome Juan Cole back to the show. How are you doing, Juan?
Just fine, Scott. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thanks for joining us again. Everybody, you know Juan Cole. He writes the great blog Informed Comment at juancole.com. He's a professor of history at the University of Michigan and is the author of the new book, Engaging the Muslim World, which I'm sorry it's on my still-to-read list, a pile of books, I guess I should say, Juan, but I'll get to it soon.
Well, it's I'm told it's a real page-turner.
Oh, well, there you go. I'm willing to buy that. Although I got it for free, but, you know, that's different. Okay. I think my first question for you here is, what exactly is the definition of Taliban? Then, now, however you want to address it, what does Taliban mean, Juan?
Right. So the Taliban, you know, the word means seminary students. It means people who are going to a religious seminary and are students there. And the Taliban were the children of the Afghan refugees who were displaced from Afghanistan by the Soviet invasion and occupation of the 1980s. And it was an enormous movement of population. Afghanistan in the 80s, you know, probably had a population of something like 16 million. And 2 million Afghans went to Iran and 3 million went to Pakistan. Another 2 million were displaced inside the country. So, you know, this is like half the country is out of their homes. And the ones who went to Pakistan, they were living in tents, they had bad sewage, they didn't plan to stay, nobody wanted them to stay. A lot of the people who went there had also lost a lot of family members. That, you know, they were orphans and had seen family members killed and so forth. So the young men, some of the young men went to these seminaries on scholarships. Some of the money for the scholarships was supplied by the Arab Gulf states like Saudi Arabia. And they went through those seminaries. You know, the Muslim seminaries in northern Pakistan are not touchy-feely. You get beaten with sticks if you don't recite the Quran right, and so they were formed in a kind of discipline and esprit de corps. And I think the classroom really became their family. The friends they made there and so forth replaced the family and the village that they'd been displaced from. They were refugees. A lot of them were orphans. And then the Pakistani military intelligence gave them money and arms, and at some point in the 90s started sending them back across the border into Afghanistan. And so Afghanistan had, after the Soviets left, had fallen into civil war and warlordism, and these Taliban, these seminary students, were disciplined. They weren't corrupt. They wouldn't take bribes, and people, you know, felt like about them like they felt about Mussolini, that they made the trains run on time. There aren't, I think, very many trains in Afghanistan, but they were a force for a kind of severe social order in the wake of massive disruption of society. And then they were overthrown by the Bush administration in 2001, 2002, and replaced by the Northern Alliance, which was kind of the old warlords that had fought the Soviets. So that's the Taliban. And many of the people that are now being called Taliban in the U.S. military, by the Pentagon, and so forth, are not seminary students and don't have anything to do with that group.
Well, see, that's what it seems to me, is that ever since 2001, well, first of all, they conflated al-Qaeda with the Taliban in a day or something, and then ever since then, they've conflated the Taliban with anyone who resists the American occupation in Afghanistan. Simple as that. And I guess that's mostly the Pashtun tribesmen, because the Uzbeks and the Tajiks maybe are on the upswing under the American occupation. Is that about right?
That's right. It's largely ethnic. Although it should be pointed out, just to be fair, that a substantial number of Pashtuns, the people of southern Afghanistan and northern Pakistan, A substantial number of the Pashtuns in Afghanistan support the Karzai government and don't mind so much the U.S. and NATO being in Afghanistan.
Really?
So, yeah, there's a kind of civil conflict within the Pashtuns over these issues.
And so what percentage then of the, I guess not necessarily in raw numbers of people, but in terms of actual power in the region, what about the actual Taliban as compared to the non-Taliban, whatever political leaders or warlords or whatever among the Pashtuns, tribes, tribal chiefs or what?
The U.S. intelligence estimates that what they're calling the Taliban control about 10% of the country. And I think that's also about the popular support for them, because 5% of Afghans say in polls that they have a favorable view of Taliban. And the Pashtuns are roughly 44%, and almost all of the Taliban are Pashtun. So that would come to about 10% too, right? So both with regard to public support and with regard to territory controlled, it's about 10% of the country.
Well, so is it the case that the reason they were able to come to power in the first place was just because Bill Clinton's government and later George Bush's government was paying the Pakistanis to pay them and make them the government of the country? I mean, they hadn't ever, I guess, really conquered the whole place, but they were winning their civil war at the time that we invaded, right?
Oh, they had 90% of the country at the time we invaded. However, no, the Taliban project in the 90s really was a Pakistani project, and the U.S. wasn't involved in it, to my knowledge. The rap is quite the opposite, which is that the Bush Sr. Made a deal with the Soviets, with Gorbachev, that if the Soviets would leave, the U.S. would also just completely get out of Afghanistan and stop supplying the warlords and so forth. And so by the last year of the Bush Senior administration, in 1991, there just was no U.S. involvement in Afghanistan, and then it stayed that way in the Clinton administration. And then the Pakistanis got going with their nuclear weapons program, and Congress cut them off from U.S. aid because they were angry over the nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, Colin Powell brought them millions of dollars in the spring of 2001, right?
I'm sorry?
I'm sorry, because I don't have any good footnotes right in front of me here, but I thought that the Americans had at least encouraged or turned a blind eye toward, Pakistani support for the Taliban in Afghanistan, but also it was part of the irony of the September 11th attack was that the Bush crew was basically trying to buy off the Afghans in the lead up to the Taliban anyway, in the lead up to the September 11th attacks, right? And Colin Powell brought them a pile of money around like May or June of 2001.
Well, the Bush administration was eager to reassert itself in that area, but it just wasn't on any kind of scale. Basically, the U.S. was a non-entity in Pakistan and Afghanistan at that moment, and the most that they could hope for was, job-owning people, and there wasn't a lot of money, U.S. money, sloshing around. Mm-hmm. So, of course, what changed was September 11th focused the U.S. Attention on Afghanistan like a laser, and at that point, the U.S. threatened Musharraf, the dictator of Pakistan at that point, and made him switch around to support the overthrow of the Taliban, which had been, his project to support the Taliban. And even though he was a secular man, and Musharraf wasn't interested in fundamentalist religion at all, but it was just the Pakistani military supported the Taliban because they were a projection of Pakistani power in Afghanistan. So, now the old, what are called the old Taliban of Mullah Omar, the old seminary students from the 90s, they're just one of 4 or 5 groups that are being called Taliban, and the others are mostly the warlord groups that had been allies of the CIA and Washington in the 80s, like the Hizb-e-Islami or Islamic Party of Gulbuddin Hikmat Yar. He had been the recipient of the lion's share of CIA money in the 80s. He's now against the U.S. and attacking U.S. troops, and he's one of the leaders with whom the Karzai government and the U.S. military is kind of negotiating behind the scenes to see if they can bring him back in from the cold.